Well, Don, I'd like to talk with you a little bit about religion and science. I think you're a good person to do that. You have a sort of broad-based understanding of things and are trained as a scientist. Why don't you just tell me a little bit about your background and training that way and your own interest? You are a biologist by trade now, right?
Yeah, by trade, but my undergraduate degree was in philosophy, and my interest has been in philosophy, but I got a PhD in cell physiology and did research in biophysics for 10 years, and then now I teach biology for non-majors, where I try to integrate science and philosophy, those interests.
Well, you're the perfect dialogue partner then. I'm glad that I got you to do this program, because I want to talk about religion and science and how it relates. And I want to take a particular problem, which I think will move us into that, and that is the ecological crisis that we face. And I'm influenced by a certain study done by Lynn White, Jr., It was called, and it was an essay he wrote back in 1967. It appeared in Science magazine, as a matter of fact, periodical. It was entitled The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. Historical roots. And he says the real roots of it is in the Judeo-Christian tradition. That it's really the notion that we find in Genesis that human beings are supposed to dominate the earth, that has been used by people in the Western world in order to take on this charge of just sort of doing whatever we wanted with the earth. If it led then to industrialization and pollution, well, so be it. But there was that dominant sense that human beings had total control over the earth. So that sort of sets the stage, I think, for some of the things that I want to talk about a little here. Lynn White, Jr.
Yes. Did you want me to respond to that?
Well, yeah, why not?
Yeah, well, I would partially disagree with Lynn White and partially agree with him and say that that perspective is not limited to the Judeo-Christian tradition, but rather is to what I would call a patriarchal consciousness that influences all cultures, including scientific culture in our Western tradition here, which is the essence of patriarchal consciousness is to have dominance and to control of people and of nature.
So you see that you would say that we really shouldn't fault the Judeo-Christian tradition, but I suppose you could say that it is true, is it not, in the Western world that the biblical notions have sort of fostered a sense of science as it's grown up. In other words, you don't have the same notion of science in Taoist cultures like in China or in the Hindu cultures in India. It seems to me that in the Western world what has happened is that biblical notion has wedded itself to the Roman tradition, to a certain efficiency and so on, and with a certain control over matters that has given us modern science. Again, that would be part of Lynn White's thesis, at least, that science didn't grow up accidentally in the Western world, but that when Christianity interacted with the Roman Empire, it set up that kind of mentality, which does have a certain controlling, dominating sense to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say the real roots of modern science is Greek thought on the one hand and Thomas Aquinas on the other. The Greeks, of course, said that we can have a completely rational understanding of nature of the world, but they didn't bring in the mystical aspect. But what Thomas Aquinas did is said you can have both. You can have the biblical understanding of the world, and you can have a rational understanding. And it's, in fact, the rational understanding helps your biblical understanding on the other hand. And I think that was really the basis then to be able to develop a science of the world.
And of course, then it's interesting that you fall back on your Thomistic understanding of things there. I mean, it's not. I don't know how many people really remain influenced by Aquinas, but I think you've put your finger on part of his genius, that he was able to assimilate and put into a Christian framework the pagan wisdom, so-called, really was the Aristotelian philosophy, and put it into a synthesis where reason had its proper role, where it was proper to check the world out, to experiment with it, and to look for its underlying causes of whatever was happening in the world. So, I mean, I would tend to agree with you there. I think Lynn White's coming at it from a little different angle. And, of course, his concern was the ecological crisis particularly, not just the rise of science. I mean, although he sees them going together. But his point is that there is a domination sense that you get in the Scriptures. It goes back to the first chapters of Genesis in verses 28, 29, right in there, where it does talk about that human beings are given this charge of dominating the earth. And then he thinks that there wasn't any check on that. There wasn't any corrective around that would say, hey, wait, you better not do that. I mean, a good example would be, it seems to me, is the way Christianity came to the United States, and very influenced by the Calvinistic version of it, the Puritan outlook, the English settlers coming over, not really willing to dialogue with the American Indians. American Indians had a far different sense of the earth. The earth was inhabited by the Spirit. It was God's activity in the world, but the English settlers, influenced by Calvinistic theology, were not interested in that, and they had this hard work ethic, and that meant go out and tame the wilderness and not worry so much about somehow injuring Mother Earth. Mm-hmm. Do you want to respond to that at all?
Well, yes. I would say that what modern science did is simply take that dominance mentality that is very definitely in the Judeo-Christian tradition and in the Greek tradition, and to exploit it and emphasize it and develop it to an even greater extent. So I would fault both modern science arising at the time of Galileo and the Judeo-Christian and Greek traditions.
For the
this
ecological crisis,
yes.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting to contrast that with other cultures. Now, one of the arguments that was made against Lynn White right after he proposed this thesis was by René Dubos. And Dubos said that, Lynn White isn't right about this. And one of the main reasons is because other traditions have done the same thing. And he talks about the deforestation of China, for example, that was under the influence of Confucian thought or perhaps Taoist thinking. And they went ahead and chopped down all the forest as well, not thinking about Mother Earth or reverence for the earth as the American Indians might have, and ended up with terrible kind of ecological problems in China, which I suppose they still suffer from. So that would go back to sort of buttressing your thesis, I suppose, that there's something deeper going on here, which you were thinking of as a patriarchal society. I suppose the Chinese culture was a good example of that also. It had the yin-yang, that is, the complementarity, and it didn't have the sharp conflict between the opposites, but I still think that probably the masculine element, as they saw it, was the dominant factor in that culture. Maybe it led to sort of a controlling outlook as well.
Yes. In fact, that's where I would agree with Dubos, is that the culprit here, if one wants to identify a culprit, is the patriarchal consciousness emphasizing control, at the same time de-emphasizing what some people call, like Bella, for example, an ethic of care, where the ethic of care was found more in the feminine perspective, in the ecological perspective of women, care for the environment, care for people. That's what this patriarchal consciousness has suppressed, and science has only carried that to an extreme. Mm-hmm. But it's there in all cultures, not just the Western culture.
Yeah, that is a good point. There's another aspect to this Lynn White thesis that I want to raise as well, and that is, he said, the other culprit or way of seeing it is anthropocentrism. And that's become a byword in the ecological movement. And the notion is that in the Judeo-Christian tradition, it's only the humans that are made in the image of God. The rest of creation is somehow much lower and are at the disposal, so to speak, of the center or summit of creation, which is really the human species. And that I think of that notion that someone in the ecological movement has said that if we had a parliament of all the species today, they'd all get together, and the first act of Parliament would be to vote out the human species, because the human species are somehow messing up the world and keeping us from dealing well with Mother Earth, and it's causing the ecological crisis. So anthropocentrism has been seen as the culprit again, and the notion is that the most anthropocentric religion that ever has existed is Christianity, and that therefore we must somehow get rid of Christianity if we're ever going to solve our environmental problems. That's another aspect of this that might be worth exploring.
Yes, and I'd like to modify that, though, because in the West, as well as other cultures, it's not so much humans that are identified as the only important ones, but rather male humans, so that there's a distinction made even in the West between males and females. It's the rational males, the people who develop rationality and control mentality, that are thought of as the most important. Everyone else, including women who are identified with nature, as less important and to be dominated. So I would say it's not Christianity that we need to get rid of. We need to get rid of this kind of thinking of that rational males are superior, and to go to a more of a holistic view that we are all part of a grand whole, and that we all deserve reverence, not just human males, but females and all of nature need to be revered. That's the solution.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you from a slightly different angle, and that is that I don't think we can get rid of anthropocentrism. I think the fact of the matter is that we are the leading edge of the evolutionary process. We humans are, evolution become conscious of itself, and we do have a responsibility to shape the direction of the future. In fact, I think a lot of the gains we have made in the modern world are based on the idea of the dignity and worth of the person, of putting humans in the center of things. I think also there's sort of a common sense argument that you can't say that mosquitoes are as important as human beings. I mean, it flies in the face of certain just fundamental notions that we have in our psyche, I think. Of course, you could say, well, that's a human bias, that from a mosquito viewpoint it would look differently. But, I mean, as we try to examine the world and make sense out of it, I mean, we are a much higher developed form of life. And if you're going to put us on an equal par with mosquitoes, and I mean, it doesn't sound right to me. So from a lot of viewpoints, I think we have to preserve anthropocentrism. I think Lynn White is right in saying that Christianity is the most anthropocentric religion we've ever had. And because what it says is that God became one of the humans. The humans are so important that God came and pitched his tent in our midst and walked around in our history and in our time, in our space, as Jesus of Nazareth. So it does have an anthropocentric, that is to put man in the center sort of mentality here. I want to maintain that and have what I think is a more common sense approach and say we need an anthropocentrism that is liberating, that has a care ethic connected with it, as much as you suggested, I think, that says that, well, we humans are responsible and we dare not just do whatever we want with the earth, but we are to tend it and to care for it and to really end up reverencing it.
Yes. Well, of course, I agree with that, too, in this sense, that I think humans are a unique species in that whereas all other species fit into the grand cycles of nature, humans can take responsibility for their own evolution, their own life. And no other species has that kind of power. So we need to recognize that. But then we now need to recognize further that in taking that responsibility, we must revere nature rather than simply trying to dominate. And we must try to fit into those grand cycles at the same time as we try to have some kind of control over our life situation.
Mm-hmm. Fit in as well as control, you're saying, mm-hmm. Yes. I think that's part of it. And as we're going along here, Don, I'm thinking we're supposed to be talking about religion and science. Are we on the topic? I think we are. I mean, religion and science, how they can blend together, right? And I mean, what sort of dialogue is possible between them? And I guess this, when you look at it from the ecological perspective, what you end up saying is that religion and science have been sort of in a destructive partnership often vis-a-vis the material world. Mm-hmm. That together they've adopted a similar outlook, or they have come together around this question and say we must control the world, we have to dominate it in one way or another.
Yes. So I'd go further and to say that even in religion there's been this lack of balance, but there has always been a tradition of mysticism, even in the Western tradition, of Saint John of the Cross, Saint Teresa of Avila, that looks into the psychological depths of their own soul as to what is life all about. But traditional Christian religion tends to ignore that. And what I think is we need to reestablish a balance. Yes, on the one hand, we take control of our lives, but on the other hand, we have to fit in and revere one another and nature. And that's something that Western religion has not been able to do, in my view.
Yeah, I think that what it moves us to do from the theological religious perspective is to go back and reread our tradition and find out how indeed we can function as proper stewards of the earth. And while Lynn White and the other ecologists have focused on Genesis, the first chapter, where it says human beings are to have dominion over the earth, the overall story presents the humans as tending the garden, as being stewards. To be a steward is very far different from just raping the earth. The steward tends to the well-being of the earth, and it recognizes a kinship with other species, so that humans name the species, yes, but they also to live in harmony with the other species on the earth. So right within the book of Genesis, the very beginning of the Bible, we have a very different understanding of religion, which would lead us to an ecological ethic, an ethic of care, of compassion, of really a contextual kind of ethic where we see ourselves in relationship to the rest of the world rather than in competition with it. And I think that, and then you can play that throughout the Christian tradition. I mean, you can see the Psalms, some of the Psalms that the Israelites had. Psalm 104, for example, which really gives a sense of praising nature and as God's creation. And then if you look at the New Testament, you see the same sort of thing, that Jesus had great respect. You know, look at the birds of the air and the flowers of the field, and let's learn from those things. And all the way through, then, you see, as you suggested, the mystics who had a different sort of outlook. It was far less competitive. It was more holistic, saw things as interdependent. We see that with St. Bonaventure in the Middle Ages. You mentioned Thomas Aquinas before. Well, his contemporary was St. Bonaventure, who had a very different notion. For him, the world had vestiges of the Trinity in it. The world was to be reverenced, and you had to have a contemplative outlook towards it rather than a controlling one, precisely because God was found in that world, in the created world. And we see that in St. Francis of Assisi, great example of one who talked to the animals, as the legends have it, and identified himself with nature and found his delight. He saw that all the material things in the world were like a ladder. The beautiful things were like a ladder that would take you up to the source of the beauty. Mm-hmm. So to pick up on your point there, in other words, there is within the Judeo-Christian tradition a far different outlook that would tend to look differently on this ecological crisis.
Yes.
How about from the viewpoint of science? I mean, now maybe we have to correct science. We start out by saying that religion and science were sort of a partner in a destructive, controlling, rational attitude. How are we going to get a partnership going now in a more constructive way?
I think just as we have to see the mystical dimension of religion, we also have to see it in science, that both religion and science can formulate their viewpoints in a rational way. Rational dogmas, say, for religion, and rational formulas for science. But both then can step back and see, well, what is the meaning of these set of formulas? And that meaning can only be expressed by metaphor, both in religion and in science. And once you go there...
Is there any way to stop science from just moving forward? I mean, the usual thing is to say, well, if science can do it, then let's do it. So if science finds a new way to produce energy, but it happens to hurt the environment, well, it seems like it just goes ahead. Science keeps experimenting. The scientist, by very nature, has to inquire and to check out hypotheses and break new ground. I mean, is there any way for science to sort of check itself in this way? Or will it always run wild and just keep going? Because, I mean, the premise, I think, here is that when religion and science did meld together, that science then adopted this controlling attitude, but it produced technology, and it's technology that has given us many of the problems. And science will continue to produce technology. So my question to you is there a check in any way from within the scientific world?
Well, I think you even suggested a way that if it can be done, it should be done. What that right away tells us is that science functions on values, just as anything does. So it's the values that a scientist espouses. And here we need to have science espouse new kinds of values, not simply the value of control to dominate, to do what is possible.
What would that look like? I mean, suppose we said that, yeah, that's right, science has to check itself, critique itself, adopt a new value system. Incidentally, before we go on to that, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, even a lot of the value-free discourse that's supposedly associated with science has a value built into it. And what's important is, and what the theologian should do in dialoguing with scientists is try to see, well, what are those values that are implicit in what you're saying? What are the philosophical presuppositions involved? That might be one of the valuable contributions a theologian could make to the dialogue. Right. But anyway, that said, I go back to my question about the values and what sort of values ought science foster that would be countercultural in this sense.
Well, that goes back to my original position of patriarchal consciousness. That kind of consciousness has values of control, of total rational knowledge. And if we move to a non-patriarchal consciousness, we would change our values. And there's a practical way in which we can do that.
Science has to work according to reason and to control and empirical method, right?
No, not really. That is, science doesn't have to espouse that kind of value as the ultimate. It can espouse the value of the reverence for nature, but then when it proposes theories, it uses its method and a rational approach. But the rational approach is related to a more fundamental issue of value. Is your value to primarily dominate nature, or is it to come into some sort of harmony with it, or to understand it, to contemplate it? That's a value.
So you're saying that the empirical method within science, which has really functioned as the be-all, end-all, has been sort of the scientific method has been the idol, if I could put it that way. It's often produced what we call scientism, but it was sort of a sine qua non. It was of the very essence of the scientific enterprise. And I guess what you're telling me is that you can take that methodology, the one that quantifies and measures and uses experiments and hypotheses and so on, and put that in a larger framework, that science can do that itself, and say there's a larger framework. Is that right?
Yes, into a mystical framework. Again, using the analogy of what actually St. Thomas Aquinas did. His ultimate value was he wanted to see God. And he used reason to try to formalize his insights about God and reality. But at the end of his life, when he actually began to experience God more directly in his mystical experiences, he gave up his theological endeavors. Yes. In other words, he expressed the fundamental value that mystical experience, direct experience, is more important than my rational formalism.
Well, as he said at that point, all the theology I've written was as straw. That was the famous line, I think, that he saw all of that as having less value than he might have thought of at one time due to his deeper mystical experiences. So you're using an analogy there and saying modern science has to do the same thing?
Yes. Individual scientists, in fact, have done it and can do it. Even some of the quantum mechanics people in modern science, like Schrödinger, who helped formulate the quantum theory, had a deeper value that essentially he said, if as a scientist you can't relate this to the human experience, it's not all that important. That science has an obligation to relate what they're doing to the larger experience of what it means to be a human being.
You know, in one sense, it isn't different because even Newton was driven by theological considerations. I think the classical scientists saw themselves as somehow part of a larger system, that science was almost a part of moral theology. I might be going too far there, but that dimension was certainly in there. And it's really only a briefer period of time after Newton and up till the current time that scientists would have adopted an atheistic posture or a value-free discourse or pretended as though the empirical method was the final word. Don't we associate that with Bacon very often as bringing in that empirical method that way? And I don't know if we want to get into the history of the science that way, but I am correct in saying, am I not, that many of the scientists, up and including Newton, really had this moral dimension in their thinking?
Well, yes and no. I would say Newton, on the one hand, when you think of his law of gravity, the fundamental idea of it was a mystery, but he didn't want to deal with that and just dealt with the mathematical representation, namely the law of gravity. And that began to dominate his life. But underneath that, he was really, as some people quote him, as being the last of the magicians. He had a sense of the mystery of the universe. But I think he was flawed, and he felt as if he could understand that mystery in terms of a mathematical model. I think that's a fundamental flaw, even in Newton.
But he did retain that larger religious framework. He was a believing person and a moral person, and he thought the ethical considerations were important. And I guess what you're saying is you're looking for a modern version of that, but which will recognize the limitations of the empirical method, right? Yes. Which will subsume it under a larger value system, or even under a larger philosophy, I suppose, that the world is ultimately mysterious.
Yes, in other words, I would say we can revision science. On the one hand, keep all the rigor and the control that science gives us, but on the other hand, fit it into a larger picture of a mysterious universe that we can revere and contemplate and be part of.
So this is going to give us then this constructive partnership that I'm looking for, because we're talking about the relationship between religion and science. And in a sense, if they both keep a larger perspective, then they're going to be able to work together to try to create a better and more harmonious world for us. I mean, because after all, the problems are massive, aren't they? We're not dealing with a minor crisis here when you're talking greenhouse effect and the extensive pollution that we have. we really do end up having to do something about it. And so maybe we get a constructive partnership here, huh?
Yes.
That I think can do us good.
Right. In other words, the first problem to solve with regard to the ecological crisis is to come to revere nature, the way, say, the American Indian does, but do that revering without having to give up our scientific control, because if we were to give up science, our life would be impossible given the population we have now. So we need this to establish a new balance of control of nature on the one hand, but revering of nature on the other. So we have a cooperative partnership with her.
And there we would get learn from another religious tradition, as you suggest, the American Indians, who for God was the great spirit inhabiting the whole of the world, and it was proper to think of Mother Earth and really not harming Mother Earth. So that dialogue would certainly be important, wouldn't it, as we try to work out this ecological ethic.
Yes.
I think you had a good sense of that notion of care that comes in there. You want to just briefly comment on that, the care for the earth?
Yes, right. I was, again, relaying it back to patriarchal consciousness, is the patriarchal consciousness emphasizes control, but what some people call a non-patriarchal is the ethic of care, and we somehow need to balance those two, not choose one or the other, but have both.
And you've stressed that throughout, Don, I think very effectively, that balance that we need. So we've been talking about the relationship between religion and science. And as we've seen it historically, both religion and science have often been controlling and dominating. And Lynn White suggests that comes right out of the book of Genesis, control the earth. But we've tried to see it more positively, that both science and religion, if they keep a larger perspective, if they remember the religious and mysterious dimension of life, then both can move forward in a partnership to try to overcome this ecological crisis.